Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very grateful to Jason Kuznicki and Gene Healy in the Cato Institute for this opportunity to speak, and all of you for coming out. I've prepared these remarks. I think it's going to take us about 30 minutes talking about this topic here. Today, we see a lively interest in plumbing the depths of knowledge. Daniel Kahneman talks about thinking fast and slow, and Jonathan Haidt distinguishes minds awake and asleep. Today, I consider our knowledge in relation to the tasks to which we use that knowledge. Our knowledge is rich and deep and multifaceted, but is it up to the task? By admitting the complexities of the things to be known, and by appreciating the richness of knowledge per se, we better assess the adequacy of the knowledge we actually have. A candid understanding of knowledge makes us more virtuous and more libertarian. Hayek spoke of the pretense of knowledge and the fatal conceit, and Smith denounced the folly and presumption of interventionists. Indeed, I think that the new candidness, and I think there is sort of a new candidness, about knowledge may illuminate the errors of governmentalizing social affairs. The theme is certainly alive among classical liberals today. For example, Jeffrey Friedman writes about the depths of public ignorance. Mark Pennington explains the epistemic failings of governmentalization. Roger Koppel speaks of epistemic monopoly in governmentalized affairs. And Brian Kaplan and Paul Rubin tell of systematic biases in the public's thinking. One of the funny things about knowledge is that as we plumb its depths, we never seem to get to a bottom. There always seems to be more plumbing to do. Students of Smith, Hayek, and Polanyi, however, have gotten used to that. They, those authors, taught us that behind any articulation of an interpretation of things or of an means-ends framework we supposedly pursue is a well of tacit knowledge from which the articulation emerged. And it emerges not as a representation complete and faithful to what we know, imagine an articulation of how to ride a bicycle, but merely an articulation we manage to spit out under the circumstances. Indeed, we expect our interpretations to evolve. As soon as we get an interpretation into words, we learn to tinker with it. Polanyi noted the, quote, peculiar opportunity offered by explicit knowledge for reflecting on it critically, end quote. With email, Facebook, and iPhones, we lose no time. As soon as a blogger sets out an interpretation, the comments field piles up criticisms and variations. Even our best interpretations may be self-retiring. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith discussed the dialectics of our notions of propriety. Propriety in Smith is the benchmark separating what is praiseworthy from what is blameworthy. Each community eye, as it were, develops its understandings of propriety, and that's something to be known, or you hope to be known. In that way, men interpret the conduct and character first of their neighbors and afterwards of themselves, to echo the full title of Smith's work. In affairs between equals, between you and your neighbor, Smith affirmed an invisible hand in the evolution of our interpretations. He wrote, this is the equal relationship, frankness and openness conciliate confidence. We trust the man who seems willing to trust us. We see clearly, we think, the road by which he means to conduct us, and we abandon ourselves with pleasure to his guidance and direction. He goes on, the great pleasure of conversation and society besides arises from a certain correspondence of sentiments and opinions, from a certain harmony of minds which, like so many musical instruments, coincide and keep time with one another. But this most delightful harmony cannot be obtained unless there is free communication of sentiments and opinions. Sometimes, however, the circumstances do not conduce to free communication and openness. The circumstances may, in fact, impel us to leave out some of what we know or even misrepresent it. This is especially likely when dealing with people who wield great power over us, are not terribly reasonable, and are not accountable for how they deal with us in return. Perhaps here in Washington, D.C., you can imagine some such circumstances. Smith's optimism about the equal-equal relationship was coupled with a pessimism about the superior-inferior relationship. About those, he said, and I can only give a sample, in the courts of the princes, in the drawing rooms of the great, where success and preferment depend not upon the esteem of intelligent and well-informed equals, but upon the fanciful and foolish favor of ignorant, presumptuous, and proud superiors, flattery and falsehood too often prevail. In assessing the invisible hand in morals and culture, then, Smith said that in equal-equal relationships, it has the upper hand, but not in superior-inferior relationships. Smith's drift is that this is a good reason to oppose the governmentalization of social affairs. He wanted as much as possible the equal-equal relationship, not the superior-inferior relationship, not only because it makes us wealthier and healthier, but because it makes our lives more becoming. Good culture is one of the good consequences of natural liberty. Culture is the knowledge we practice. It is characterized especially in the interpretation and judgment facets of knowledge. Knowledge entails three facets: information, interpretation, and judgment. A story may help illuminate these facets. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson go on a camping trip. After a good dinner and a bottle of wine, they retire for the night and go to sleep. Some hours later, Holmes wakes and nudges his faithful friend. "Watson, look up at the sky and tell me what you see." "I see millions and millions of stars, Holmes," replies Watson. "And what do you deduce from that?" Watson ponders for a moment. "Well, astronomically, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, I observe that Saturn is in Leo. Horologically, I deduce that the time is approximately 3:15. Meteorologically, I suspect that we will have a beautiful day tomorrow. Theologically, I can see that God is all-powerful and we are a small and insignificant part of the universe. What does it tell you, Holmes?" Holmes is silent for a moment. "Watson, you idiot, someone has stolen our tent." In this story, what matters is not a difference in information. Holmes and Watson had the same information. What differ are their interpretations. Watson looks up at the starry sky and gives 5 interpretations. Even that is not enough. As Holmes brings a 6th, someone has stolen the tent. The story is funny because of the asymmetry in interpretation. The humor lies not only in the asymmetry between Holmes and Watson. There is another asymmetry at play. When we hear of Sherlock Holmes, we expect a tale of remarkable insight, in his seeing something that is not obvious. But it turns out instead to be a story of Watson's failure to see something that should have been obvious, namely that the tent was gone. We expect a story of Holmes' brilliance, and we get a story of Watson's dimness. Asymmetric interpretation seems to be essential to humor. Look at any line from Seinfeld or Abbott and Costello, and you will notice a shifting between different interpretations, very often between different benchmarks, either about how obvious an idea is or where the line of propriety lies. In his show, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David loves to reinterpret the lines of propriety, perhaps because, like David Hume and Adam Smith, he is leery of people's enthusiasms. Malcolm Gladwell says that an interpretation takes only a blink. It does not take much to find context, even for multiple interpretations. The name of the movie mogul, Samuel Goldwyn, itself comes in context. Even in his briefest utterances, we can find 2 standards. Consider the following. We're overpaying him, but he's worth it. Let's have some new cliches. I'll give you a definite maybe. Even as we affirm an interpretation, others lace our thoughts. In the superior-inferior relationship between my daughter and me, her familiar refrain is, "Yeah, right, Dad." In juggling interpretations, we had better keep a sense of humor. You will notice, however, that the government and governmentalized affairs are quite humorless. They may afford us objects of humor, but they are themselves, like machines, quite humorless. Knowledge entails information, interpretation, and judgment. The interpretations are multiple and keep coming, but we need to get on with things. Derek Jeter might be wrong in reading the pitch as a slider, but if he dithers too long, he might be called out on strikes. Life comes with time clocks, the length of which often being another matter of propriety. In acting, we judge among our portfolio of interpretations and decide which to take stock in. Judgment, that third one, is about the interpretations we act on. It is the action facet of knowledge. Judgment connects knowledge to practice. Only in practice is our knowledge tested, and the test results impel us to create new interpretations and sharpen our judgment. So knowledge evolves, and if we are wise, we expect it to evolve. This aspect of wisdom was highlighted in Ambrose Bierce's famous work, The Devil's Dictionary. Here is Bierce's definition of education. Education, noun, that which discloses to the wise and disguises from the foolish their lack of understanding. In other words, your fine education in particle physics surely enhances your understanding of many things, but also if you are wise, you notice some of its presuppositions, uncertainties, and mysteries, and hence ways in which you lack understanding of particle physics. You see that your interpretation is neither complete nor final, and for some problems may even be misleading. The point looms larger in social sciences and corresponds to words written by the preeminent English economist Alfred Marshall. In 1917, he wrote the following words, "But the more I studied economic science, the smaller appeared the knowledge which I had of it in proportion to the knowledge that I needed. And now, at the end of nearly half a century of almost exclusive study of it, I am conscious of more ignorance of it than I was at the beginning of the study." Here, Marshall was expressing a lingering Smithian humility. Marshall wanted to serve universal benevolence, but he felt daunted by the economy's unknowability. How are intellectuals, experts, and regulators to know enough to manipulate society beneficially? But you might ask, if our knowledge is so limited, how does anyone get on in life? If knowledge is so shifting and disjointed, how do private actors build their projects? If government cannot succeed, how is it that private actors can? And if private actors can succeed, why can't government? Also, how is it that the classical liberal philosopher knows whatever it is that he pretends justifies his conclusions in politics and policy? What about his humility? Indeed, the commentator from the Cato Institute may seem anything but humble. I see a couple of important differences. First, the private actor, compared to the benevolent regulator, moves in a much more limited space and indeed will tend to confine his movements to a space that his knowledge can handle. He is like the skater on the floor of the roller rink, careful to preserve his well-being and minding the conditions around him. The skater's actions are local, and his knowledge need not be more than local. He does not need to know or understand the entire system of skating, or even think about it. In the social world, the individual moves likewise into limited space, and again, only when confident that he interprets competently. Smith said, "The people seek praise and praiseworthiness, and people avoid blame and blameworthiness, and not least in the marketplace. They mind the proprieties of their context. The benchmarks of proprieties develop in context and bottom up. In the equal relationship in private affairs, movements tend to evolve in a fashion that respects the limits of knowledge. Thus, Smith's optimism about affairs among equals. Smith said that the standards of propriety are loose, vague, and indeterminate, making for knowledge problems. But for the private actor, that which is to be known is much more modest than for the expert or intellectual who proposes to manipulate the great system. Regular people can negotiate their knowledge problems. Moreover, there is another important difference. Consider this from Smith. The general rules of almost all the virtues, the general rules which determine what are the offices of prudence, of charity, of generosity, of gratitude, of friendship, are in many respects loose and inaccurate, admit of many exceptions, and require so many modifications that it is scarce possible to regulate our conduct entirely by our regard to them. Smith associated this looseness, which he attributed to almost all the virtues, with aesthetics, thus seeing the general rules of nearly all virtues as akin to the vague rules that we invoke when we speak of what is good in movies, music, and novels, for example. But this is not the case for all the virtues. He explains, there is, however, one virtue of which the general rules determine the greatest exactness. There is, however, one virtue of which the general rules determine with the greatest exactness every external action which it requires. This virtue is justice. The rules of justice are accurate in the highest degree. The whole nature and circumstances of the action prescribed are all of them precisely fixed and determined. Whereas all the other virtues relate to propriety benchmarks, engendering a negative range of blame and a positive range of praise, justice, or more specifically, commutative justice, as Smith actually calls it later in the work, is not a matter of propriety, but a matter of grammar. That's Smith's analogy. It is not loose, vague, and indeterminate, but precise and accurate. It engenders only a negative range of blame. There is no praise for abiding by commutative justice. The point is illustrated in the analogy to grammar by a blank piece of paper, which contains no violations of grammar, but wins you no praise. Commutative justice, Smith says, is abstaining from what is another's, or not messing with other people's stuff. All the other virtues are quite different. They are about making the becoming use of what is our own, as well as holding particular objects in proper value or esteem. Becoming is a much subtler affair than not messing with other people's stuff. Even in the subtle affair of becoming, however, the private actor copes by keeping his movements local. But more importantly, he often needs not fret about becoming, but may simply adhere to the social grammar. His movements may be guided principally by commutative justice, which usually poses no knowledge problem at all. What constitutes commutative justice in Hume, Smith, and classical liberalism generally is property, consent, and contract. Smith takes a loan of £10, and commutative justice requires that he repay the lender as agreed. Society can get by principally by commutative justice, which Smith says is the main pillar which upholds the whole edifice, whereas the becoming virtues are the ornaments which embellish our social world. At the roller rink, spontaneous order happens before our very eyes. It works by a coincidence of interest. In promoting my interest in avoiding collision with you, I also promote your interest in avoiding collision with me. In the economy at large, we also find a coincidence of interest. In promoting my interest in gaining in a voluntary exchange with you, I also promote your interest in gaining in a voluntary exchange with me. This coincidence of interest helps us understand the spontaneous coordination of economic affairs. No question, our voluntary exchanges entail many subtle proprieties, and our whole allegiance to commutative justice stems from deeper becoming virtues. Nonetheless, much of market conduct is simply commutative justice, about which the knowledge problems are really mostly quite minor. You pay at the counter. The disjointedness of knowledge, then, does not plague liberalism in the way that it plagues statist ideologies. Indeed, it bolsters liberalism. The centerpiece of liberalism is the presumption of liberty, and liberty is the flip side of commutative justice. In a liberal culture, people presume that people are innocent until proven guilty, and that the government is not to mess with people's stuff until it convincingly proves a significant net benefit in messing with people's stuff, or in doing things that, if done by a neighbor, would be patently coercive and criminal. In contravening the liberty principle, in favoring the governmentalization of affairs, then, the statist forsakes the rather accurate rules of commutative justice and the bottom-up local proprieties. He attempts to manipulate the whole from the top down. Thus, the statist, forsaking the grammar and forsaking the local knowledge of local proprieties, is doubly plagued by knowledge problems. It is only from great hubris that intellectuals and governments came to the statist mentalities that now engulf us. The humility revealed by Marshall soon became quite unfashionable in economics. The fashion that followed was to flatten economics down to whatever was susceptible to formal modeling. In the 1960s and 70s, such figures as Kenneth Arrow, George Stigler, and Joseph Stiglitz flatten knowledge down to information. But you remember, there were three facets of knowledge. To omit interpretation and judgment from our sense of knowledge is to presuppose that interpretation is singular and fixed. It is to presuppose symmetric interpretation. And if interpretation is singular and fixed, then there is no matter of judging among interpretations. Judgment matters only if interpretations are multiple. In the past 40 years, there have been thousands of academic papers written about asymmetric information, and very few about asymmetric interpretation. Indeed, the economics literature almost never speaks of interpretation or judgment. Economists think they plumb the depths of knowledge when they speak of asymmetric information. The flattening of knowledge down to information, or what I call flat talk in economics, gives the false sense that the theorist has or can have some composite master interpretation that subsumes the interpretations of those within the system. When economists practice flat talk, they make it seem that more and better knowledge is merely an informational problem. They recognize the cost of search, but they presuppose knowledge of the boxes to search over. They fancy that the government is then in a position to manipulate incentives. Thus, flat talk flatters so-called experts as able to intervene beneficially. An interpretation is right only in the sense that it is better than the relevant alternative interpretation. It isn't right in the sense of final or definitive. But once the government starts acting on an interpretation, that interpretation tends to become ossified. Even if the government seizes on a pretty good interpretation of what is going on now, it is likely to cling to that interpretation long after it should have been superseded. Moreover, governmentalization of interpretation tends to regiment social affairs and repress the evolution of interpretation. Rather than fitting its interpretations to the world, government often tries to fit the world to its interpretations. The attitude seems to be that if our expert understanding of things isn't common knowledge, well, we'll see to it that it becomes common knowledge. I should add, however, that even government operatives often do not really believe in and act according to official interpretations. The crumminess of government interpretation gives rise to all manner of interpretational falsification, dissonance, and confusion. By nature, government is both Kafkaesque and Orwellian. It is knowledge problems that make government farcical. Officials and regulators know little about that which they are to regulate. For knowledge, they can only turn to people with some knowledge, often people who work in the regulated industries. When the government taps such parties, new absurdities flower. If the conversation is friendly and cooperative, commentators clamor against the influence of lobbyists and special interests. If the conversation is fearsome and demanding, some complain that business withheld information or misled officials. Either way, interested parties, some in a government chokehold, serve up descriptions of things, descriptions that are then received as official knowledge. Politicians, bureaucrats, experts, and journalists have little choice but to play along. Sometimes even analysts from Cato, no doubt, must play along. But the farce crescendos in our highest political superstitions. Flattalk also flatters the ordinary person as fit to know what policies to favor and whom to vote for. Thus, as I see it, Flattalk tends to go with social democratic sensibilities, as represented, for example, by Donald Whitman, who says democracy is efficient. Adam Smith, however, spoke of the ordinary fellow as, quote, being unfit to judge, even though he was fully informed. You might ask Smith, but if the fellow is fully informed, how can he be unfit to judge? Smith's answer is that, quote, his education and habits leave him unfit to judge. That is, his portfolio of interpretations and his judgment. The chief problem, then, is not a lack of information. It was by flattening knowledge down to information that Donald Whitman made the systematic failings of democracy disappear in his work. Flattalk, it seems to me, plays to deep-seated yearnings for a sense of common knowledge and common experience, a universal human weakness. Hayek wrote of a concurrence between the intellectual's pretense of knowledge and certain primordial, upper Paleolithic instincts of humans generally. The concurrence between intellectual hubris and rude instinct makes a tacit alliance against the enlightened sensibilities of liberal civilization. The opponents of true liberalism might regard the teachings of Hayek and Smith as quaint verities. Intellectuals and regulators sometimes suggest that knowledge problems are being overcome by virtue of new technologies that enhance the government's ability to know. But new technology plays on both sides. New technologies also accelerate economic change and multiply the connections among activities. They make the whole economy, that which is to be known, far more complex. After all, society includes the thoughts and potentialities of private actors, each of whom has likewise enjoyed enhanced capabilities by virtue of new technologies. The complexity of what is to be known outstrips the capabilities of the intellectual or regulator. New technology should make intellectuals not more ready, but ever less ready to contravene the liberty principle. The Federal Register of 2011 filled some 82,000 triple-column pages of dense text. It is something to which many passages from The Wealth of Nations speak. But I would like to conclude by returning to the theory of moral sentiments. The theory of moral sentiments teaches us that knowledge problems should disabuse us of the urge or the aspiration to make grammatical something ineluctably loose, vague, and indeterminate. To illustrate that foolish aspiration, Smith pointed to the books of casuistry that sought to guide confessors in the church. Smith says, let's see where I am here. Smith says that the casuists attempted to provide a grammar for all human conduct. It is the end of casuistry, he said, to prescribe rules for the conduct of a good man. By observing all the rules of casuistry, we should be entitled to considerable praise by the exact and scrupulous delicacy of our behavior. Smith roundly criticized such pretenses of the books of casuistry, calling them generally as useless as they are commonly tiresome. What he said about the casuists might be applied to those responsible for the content of the Federal Register. That frivolous accuracy which they attempted to introduce into subjects which do not admit of it almost necessarily betrayed them into those dangerous errors, such as chicaning with our consciences and evading the most essential articles of our duty, and at the same time rendered their works dry and disagreeable. In this respect, perhaps the Feds and the statist intellectuals are the new casuists, and the modern state is the new hegemonic church. I've mentioned that David Hume and Adam Smith disliked enthusiasm, but do not forget their equal dislike of superstition. If enthusiasm distorts the mundane and grammatical in grasping after the sublime, superstition distorts the sublime in striving for a grammar. A sensitivity to the richness of knowledge made Hume and Smith leery of both sorts of distortions. In liberal civilization, proprieties bubble up among equals in their spontaneous pursuits of happiness. People pursue the ornaments which embellish their lives within a grammar that even government respects, treating any exceptions to that grammar as exceptional. Thank you for your attention.